Think she even knows how to hold a rifle? The comment drifted across the range from where 3 Navy SEALs stood near the equipment shed, their eyes tracking Kira Vance as she hauled a replacement target frame toward the 1,000-meter line. One of them laughed, the sound carrying easily in the desert morning air. Probably thinks the scope is a telescope. Kira kept her expression neutral, her boots crunching against the gravel as she maneuvered the awkward steel frame into position. The sun was already aggressive at 0700, promising the kind of heat that would have shooters struggling with Mirage by mid-morning. She learned to tune out the comments over the past 18 months, the casual dismissals that came with being the only woman on a range where special operations teams trained for scenarios most people couldn't imagine. Chief Warrant Officer Hayes Brennan emerged from the range operations building, clipboard in hand, his weathered face already showing the focus that came before major training exercises. He stopped near the firing line, watching as a full SEAL platoon assembled their gear with the efficient precision of operators who'd done it 1,000 times. His eyes passed over Kira without pause, the same way they always did, cataloging her as equipment rather than personnel. "Vance," he called out without looking directly at her. "Need all targets verified and painted by 0830. We've got brass coming in from Coronado to observe qualifications." She acknowledged with a simple nod, securing the frame and beginning the walk back toward the shed where fresh paint and marking supplies waited. Behind her, she heard one of the younger SEALs, a petty officer named Cortez, speaking to his teammate. "Man, they really let anyone work these ranges now." His tone carried that particular brand of dismissal that came from assumptions made without thought. "Next they'll have her spotting for us." The other operator snorted. "Yeah, that'll be the day. She can barely lift those target frames without struggling." Kira's jaw tightened fractionally, but her pace never changed. She'd heard variations of these comments since her first week, back when she'd taken this position specifically because it was supposed to be anonymous, technical, separate from the competitive shooting world she'd left behind. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd gone from national rankings and international competitions to being treated as invisible by men who probably couldn't match her worst qualifying score. Before we dive into this story, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you've seen women overlooked in male-dominated fields where you're from. The range master, Dale Cortland, was already at the shed when she arrived, organizing ammunition crates with the methodical attention of someone who'd spent 3 decades in military service. He glanced up as she entered, his expression neutral but not unkind. "Big day today," he said, hauling a crate of 7.62 onto the workbench. "Commander Merrick is flying in specifically to observe this qualification shoot. Team 5 needs to certify on extended range scenarios before their deployment window closes." Kira pulled on work gloves and began gathering paint supplies. "How extended?" 1,200 meters, primary target. 1,500 for the advanced qualification. Cortland wiped sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. "Challenging conditions, too. Wind's supposed to pick up around 1,000, and the heat's going to make the Mirage brutal." She nodded, automatically calculating the variables in her head. 1,200 meters in desert wind with rising thermals meant the shooters would need to account for significant drift and vertical dispersion. The target zone would be dancing in the Mirage by the time they reached the critical qualification window. It was the kind of shot that separated competent snipers from exceptional ones. "Just make sure you stay behind the safety line once they start shooting," Cortland continued, his tone taking on the edge of instruction he always used when reminding her of protocols. "These guys are professional, but with brass watching and career implications on the line, everyone's going to be dialed in and focused. Don't want any distractions on the range." The implication was clear enough. Stay out of the way. Don't interfere with the real operators doing real work. She'd become expert at reading the subtext, the gentle reminders that her role was support, background, technical maintenance rather than anything approaching tactical. "Understood," she replied, loading her supplies into a range cart. By 0815, she was back at the far target line, methodically verifying each frame stability and applying fresh marking paint to ensure clear impact identification. The SEAL team had spread across the firing line, each operator checking equipment with the focused intensity of professionals who knew that qualification failures meant deployment delays or worse. Petty Officer First Class Garrett Drummond, Team 5's primary designated marksman, was settling into position at the main firing point, his custom rifle already mounted on its bipod. He was checking his data book, reviewing previous performance logs while his spotter made environmental readings with orchestral weather meter. Winds variable, the spotter announced. 3 to 7 knots, shifting between 270 and 10 degrees. Drummond nodded, making notes. Mirage is already starting. Going to be a challenging window. From her position at the target line, Kira could see what they couldn't from the firing point. The wind patterns at this range created predictable but complex variations, with a depression at the 800-meter mark that created a consistent shift in bullet trajectory. She'd watched dozens of shooters struggle with it, never quite understanding why their carefully calculated dope wasn't matching their impacts. She pressed the radio on her vest. Targets verified and marked. Ready for hot range. Brennan's voice crackled back. Copy. Clear the target line and return to observation point. We're going hot in 5 minutes. Kira gathered her equipment and began the long walk back, the desert stretching vast and empty around the range complex. Behind her, she heard Cortez speaking to another SEAL, their conversation carrying in the still air. Think Drummond's going to nail it first shot? Man, I hope so. Last thing we need is to look shaky with the commander watching. His voice dropped slightly, but remained audible. At least we don't have to worry about the target girl screwing anything up as long as she stays out of the way. The comment was casual, thoughtless, the kind of dismissal that came from never considering someone might be more than they appeared. Kira's hands tightened slightly on the card handle, but her expression remained neutral, professional, exactly what 18 months of invisibility had taught her to maintain. The sun climbed higher, the heat building toward the brutal intensity that made this range both valuable for realistic training and miserable for everyone involved. At the observation point, she secured her cart and pulled out her own spotting scope, a habit from old instincts that died hard. She might be invisible to them, but she could still watch, still analyze, still see the microscopic details that separated good shooting from exceptional shooting. On the firing line, Drummond was settling into his final preparation, his breathing already controlled, his focus narrowing to the precise task ahead. Commander Thane Merrick had arrived, his uniform crisp despite the heat, his presence adding weight to an already high-stakes qualification. Brennan's voice carried across the range. Range is hot. Shooters, you may commence when ready. The qualification had begun, and Kira was exactly where everyone expected her to be. Behind the line, out of the way, watching from a distance that kept her separate from the real operators doing real work. They had no idea that the invisible range tech observing through a spotting scope had forgotten more about precision shooting than most of them would ever learn. The first shot of the day echoed across the desert, and she tracked its impact with an expert eye that saw everything. The first shot missed left by 0.3 mils, the impact kicking up dust 40 centimeters from the target center mass. Through her spotting scope, Kira watched Drummond make his correction, his spotter feeding him adjustment data, while Brennan observed with crossed arms and Commander Merrick made notes on his tablet. Wind shift caught him. Cortez muttered to the SEAL beside him, both of them standing near the observation point where Kira had positioned herself. Should have waited for the lull. The second shot connected, a solid hit that brought approving nods from the command element. Drummond worked through his qualification string with professional competence, each shot demonstrating the skill that had earned him his designated marksman position. When he finished, Brennan keyed his radio. Vance, verify, and mark impacts, then reset targets for next shooter. Kira acknowledged and moved back toward the target line, her boots finding the familiar path through the desert scrub. The morning heat was building exactly as predicted, the air already beginning to shimmer with a mirage that would complicate every shot fired after 1000. She reached the 1200-meter target and examined Drummond's group, automatically cataloging the pattern, seeing the subtle consistency in his wind calls and the minor vertical stringing that suggested he was fighting his trigger press under pressure. She marked each impact with orange paint, reset the target face, and moved to the 1500-meter position where the advanced qualification would take place later. The distance was substantial enough that even experienced snipers struggled, especially in conditions like these where every environmental variable was amplified. "Target line secure," she radioed back. "Ready for next shooter." The morning progressed with methodical precision. Each SEAL took their turn, some performing better than others, all of them demonstrating the baseline competence expected of operators at this level. Kira moved between target verification and observation, maintaining her role as the invisible support element that kept the range functioning. During a break between shooters, she returned to the shed to restock paint supplies. Cortland was there, reviewing the schedule for the afternoon session. "How's it looking out there?" he asked, not looking up from his paperwork. "Solid performance overall. Drummond's running about what you'd expect. Johnson's fighting the mirage a bit. Martinez is compensating well for the wind." Cortland glanced up, something like surprise flickering across his weathered face before he caught himself. "You're tracking their performance? Hard not to when you're marking every impact." Kira kept her tone neutral, professional, the same way she kept everything neutral and professional. "Pattern recognition is pretty obvious when you see enough shots." He studied her for a moment, as if considering something he'd never quite thought about before, then returned to his paperwork. "Well, just make sure you stay focused on the technical side. These qualifications are high stakes for everyone involved." The subtext was familiar. Stay in your lane. Don't overstep. Your support staff, not an operator, not even really part of the shooting community despite working on a range every day. She'd heard variations of it from every authority figure she'd encountered here. The gentle but firm reminders that there was a clear hierarchy and she was at the bottom of it. Back at the observation point, the SEAL team was rotating through lunch in shifts, maintaining constant range coverage while ensuring everyone stayed fed and hydrated. Kira ate her own lunch quickly, a simple sandwich consumed while watching the heat waves intensify across the range floor. "Man, this mirage is going to be brutal for the afternoon session," one of the younger SEALs said, shaking his head as he looked downrange. 1,500 meters in this soup? That's going to separate the men from the boys. His teammate laughed. "Good thing we don't have to worry about the target girl trying to shoot in these conditions. She'd probably ask which way to point the rifle." They both chuckled, the easy mockery of people who'd never considered that the woman they dismissed might have forgotten more about shooting than they'd learned yet. Kira took another bite of her sandwich, her expression unchanged, her eyes still tracking the environmental conditions with the automatic assessment of someone whose mind never stopped calculating ballistics. Brennan approached the observation point, his focus on the afternoon schedule. "Vance, we're going to need the advanced qualification targets verified before 1300. Commander Merrick wants to observe the 1500-meter attempts while conditions are at their most challenging." She nodded, finishing her lunch and preparing her equipment cart. The 1500-meter targets required more detailed inspection, their frames subjected to greater stress from the longer shots and the occasional miss that impacted the surrounding berms. "Also," Brennan continued, his tone taking on the edge of specific instruction, "make sure you stay well behind the safety line during the advanced qualification. These shots are going to be complex, lots of moving parts, and I need my shooters completely focused without any distractions in their peripheral vision." "Understood, Chief." She kept her voice neutral, swallowing the irony that she was being warned to stay out of the way of shots she could probably make in her sleep. The afternoon session began with the same methodical progression as the morning, but the conditions had shifted dramatically. The mirage was now a dancing curtain of heat distortion that turned the distant targets into wavering mirages themselves. The wind had picked up to a steady 8 knots with gusts reaching 12, and the thermals were creating vertical currents that would push bullets unpredictably. "First shooter at 1500 is Martinez," Brennan announced. "Wind is 8 knots at 285 degrees. Temperature is on 08. Pressure is holding steady." Kira watched from her designated position, while behind the firing line, her own spotting scope giving her a clear view of both the shooter and the distant target. Martinez was a solid operator, his fundamentals sound, but she could see from his body language that he was already feeling the pressure of the distance and conditions. The first shot went high, missing the target completely and impacting the berm beyond. Martinez adjusted, his spotter feeding him corrections, but the second shot went wide right. 3 more attempts produced only one marginal hit, barely catching the edge of the target zone. Damn, Cortez breathed from nearby. 1,500 in this Mirage is no joke. Martinez cleared the line, his frustration evident in the set of his shoulders. Johnson took position next, his performance marginally better, but still inconsistent. The wind and Mirage were creating a combination that challenged even experienced shooters, each environmental variable compounding the others until the equation became nearly impossible to solve in real time. Commander Merrick conferred quietly with Brennan, their body language suggesting concern about the overall performance levels. These qualification standards existed for a reason, ensuring that operators could perform under the most demanding conditions. But watching skilled shooters struggle was creating tension across the entire range. Kira continued her duties, moving to verify impacts and reset targets between shooters, her movements efficient and unremarked upon. Each time she reached the target line, she absorbed more information about the conditions, her mind automatically processing the data with the expertise of someone who'd spent years mastering exactly these kinds of challenging scenarios. The range techs doing good work today, one SEAL commented to another as Kira passed them on her way back from target verification. At least she can handle the simple stuff without screwing it up. Yeah, his companion agreed. Keep her doing what she's good at and let us handle the actual shooting. The dismissal was casual, automatic, born from assumptions that ran so deep they never examined them. Kira moved past without acknowledgement, her face composed, her mind cataloging wind patterns and Mirage behavior while they discussed her limitations. The afternoon wore on, each shooter struggling with the 1,500-meter challenge, the qualification standards proving exactly as demanding as they were designed to be. The desert sun beat down with relentless intensity, and the certainty that had marked the morning session was giving way to something more uncertain, more demanding. None of them knew that the invisible woman moving between targets and observation point could read these conditions like a language they were still learning to speak. None of them suspected that their casual dismissals were directed at someone who'd competed at international levels where the margin for error was measured in fractions they couldn't imagine. Kira reset another target, marked another impact, and returned to her designated position behind the line, exactly where everyone expected her to be. The qualification continued, and she remained invisible, unremarked upon, dismissed with the casual certainty of people who'd never thought to question their assumptions. By 1600, the qualification session had become a study in frustration. Only 3 of the 12 shooters had achieved passing scores at 1,500 meters, and even those had been marginal performances that left Commander Merrick reviewing his notes with visible concern. The combination of distance, Mirage, and wind had proven more challenging than anticipated, exposing gaps in capability that deployment schedules wouldn't accommodate. Brennan called a brief halt, gathering his team for a quick debrief, while Kira completed another round of target verification. The conversation carried across the range with the clarity that came from voices raised slightly in the desert air. "We need tighter wind calls," Brennan said, his tone carrying the weight of someone who understood that careers and deployment readiness hung on these qualifications. The Mirage is creating distortion that's throwing off your range estimation. You're compensating for conditions that don't match reality. Chief, Martinez spoke up, his frustration evident. "We're calling it like we see it. These conditions are just brutal. They're the conditions you'll face downrange," Commander Merrick interjected, his voice calm but inflexible. "The enemy doesn't wait for perfect weather. If you can't perform here, you won't perform when it matters." Kira secured the 1,500-meter target and began her walk back, her mind processing what she'd observed throughout the day. The shooters weren't wrong about the conditions being difficult, but they were missing subtle patterns in how the Mirage was behaving, failing to account for the ground thermal layer that was creating a consistent vertical push. It was the kind of nuanced environmental reading that came from thousands of hours in exactly these conditions, the expertise that separated good shooters from exceptional ones. At the observation point, Cortland was organizing equipment for the next day's session. He glanced up as she approached, his expression showing the wear of a long, challenging day. "Rough afternoon," he commented, wiping dust from his sunglasses. "Haven't seen conditions this tricky in a while." "The thermal layer is creating a consistent vertical component," Kira said, almost automatically before catching herself. "The Mirage pattern has been pretty stable once you account for it." Cortland paused, his hands stilling on the equipment case. "You've been tracking the thermal layer?" She felt the familiar tension of having said too much, revealed too much of the expertise she was supposed to keep hidden. Hard not to notice when you're watching every shot. He studied her for a long moment, something shifting in his weathered features. "I've been running ranges for 30 years, and most range techs can barely tell you which direction the wind is blowing. How do you know about thermal layers affecting ballistics?" The question hung between them, an opening she wasn't sure how to navigate. Before she could formulate a response that wouldn't reveal too much, Brennan's voice cut across the range. "Cortland, need you up here for scheduling discussion. Vance, secure the range for the day. We'll resume at 0600 tomorrow." The moment passed, Cortland giving her one more appraising look before heading toward the command element. Kira released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding and began the process of securing equipment, her movements automatic while her mind raced through the implications of almost revealing her background. She'd been so careful for 18 months, maintaining the invisible anonymity that let her hide from the competitive shooting world she'd left behind. The pressure, the expectations, the constant performance demands that had finally broken something in her that couldn't be fixed by pushing harder. This job was supposed to be simple, technical, separate from all of that. As she worked, two SEALs passed nearby, their conversation drifting over. "Man, if we don't get these quals locked down tomorrow, deployment's going to be delayed," the first one said, his voice tight with stress. "And Merrick's already questioning our readiness." His companion shook his head. "We need Drummond firing on all cylinders. He's our best bet for the advanced quals. If he can't nail it, we're in trouble." "Maybe we should just ask the target girl to do it," the first one said with a laugh. "I'm sure she's got some thoughts on how to shoot better." They both laughed, the sound carrying across the empty range, the mockery so casual it was almost reflexive. Kira continued securing equipment, her face neutral, her hands steady despite the bitter irony of their words. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the desert in shades of amber and gold when she finished her duties. The range fell silent, the way it always did at the end of the day, the absence of gunfire creating a peaceful emptiness that she'd learned to appreciate. She stood for a moment at the firing line, looking downrange toward the distant targets that marked 1,200, 1,500, even 1,800 meters. Distances she'd shot competitively, ranges where she'd placed rounds with precision that earned international rankings and national championships. All of it hidden now, buried under the anonymous role of range technician who everyone assumed couldn't even hold a rifle properly. Her hands moved automatically through the familiar pre-shot routine, muscle memory so ingrained that 18 months away from competition hadn't eroded it. The way her fingers would grip the stock, the pressure point on the trigger, the breathing rhythm that steadied everything. All of it still there, waiting beneath the surface of her carefully maintained invisibility. "Vance, you still here?" Cortland's voice interrupted her reverie. She turned to find him approaching, his expression thoughtful in the fading light. "Got a question for you." She waited, uncertain where this was heading. "You ever shoot competitively?" The question was direct, cutting through the careful distance she'd maintained. "Because I've been watching you today, and you track shots like someone who knows what they're looking at. Really knows, not just basic range officer stuff." The truth sat heavy on her tongue, the old identity pressing against the anonymous present she'd constructed. She could deflect, maintain the cover she'd built so carefully, or she could acknowledge what was becoming increasingly obvious to anyone who paid attention. Long time ago, she said finally, keeping her voice neutral. Different life. How long ago? Long enough that it doesn't matter. She met his eyes steadily. I'm here to maintain targets and keep the range running, not to shoot. Cortland nodded slowly, accepting the boundary she'd drawn even as his expression suggested he understood there was more to the story. Well, for what it's worth, your technical work is solid. Best range tech we've had in years. It was meant as a compliment, and she took it as such, even though it emphasized exactly the limitation everyone saw. The range tech, the support staff, the invisible technician who kept the machinery running so the real operators could do real work. Thanks, she said simply. He headed toward the parking area, leaving her alone on the range as the sun touched the horizon. Tomorrow would bring another day of qualifications, more shooters struggling with challenging conditions, more casual dismissals from people who couldn't imagine she might be more than she appeared. Kira gathered the last of her equipment and secured the range office, her movements efficient and practiced. The drive back to her small apartment took her through the desert landscape she'd grown to know well, the familiar route giving her time to decompress from the day's tensions. Her apartment was sparse, deliberately minimal, containing nothing that connected to her previous life. No trophies, no photos from competitions, no reminders of the person she'd been before the pressure became too much and she'd walked away from everything she'd built. Just a simple space where she could be nobody, owe nothing to anyone's expectations, exist without the constant weight of performance demands. She made a simple dinner, ate alone, and sat on her small balcony watching the stars emerge in the clear desert sky. Somewhere out there, in the competitive shooting world she'd left behind, people probably still wondered what happened to Kira Vance, the shooter who'd been climbing international rankings before she disappeared completely. Here, she was just the range tech, dismissed and underestimated, exactly as invisible as she'd intended to be. Tomorrow would bring more of the same, more casual mockery, more assumptions about her limitations, more careful maintenance of the anonymity that kept her separate from everything she'd been. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent and distant, while she sat in the darkness and tried to convince herself that invisible was exactly what she wanted to be. The next morning arrived with the same relentless heat, the sun climbing into a cloudless sky that promised another day of brutal shooting conditions. Kira reached the range at 05:30, giving herself time to verify equipment and prepare targets before the SEAL team arrived for their continued qualification attempts. The range was peaceful in the early morning, the only sound the occasional whisper of wind across the desert floor. She moved through her duties with practiced efficiency, checking target frames, verifying paint supplies, ensuring every technical detail was ready for another demanding day. Cortland arrived at 0600, earlier than usual, his truck kicking up dust as it approached the range office. He found her completing the final target verification at the 1,200-meter line. Morning, he called out, approaching with 2 cups of coffee from the small pot he kept in the office. Thought you might need this. She accepted the cup with a nod of thanks, surprised by the gesture. Cortland had always been professional but distant, maintaining the clear hierarchy between range master and support staff. Been thinking about what you said yesterday, he continued, his tone casual but his eyes sharp, about the thermal layer and the mirage patterns. That's pretty advanced ballistic knowledge for someone who's just maintaining targets. Kira sipped her coffee, buying herself a moment to formulate a response that wouldn't open doors she'd worked hard to keep closed. You pick things up when you spend enough time watching people shoot. That's the thing, though. He leaned against the target frame, his weathered face thoughtful in the early light. I've been running ranges for 3 decades, trained hundreds of shooters, and I've never met a range tech who could explain thermal layers affecting trajectories. That's expert-level understanding. The truth pressed against her carefully maintained boundaries, and she felt the old tension of being seen too clearly, recognized when she'd worked so hard to remain invisible. Before she could respond, the sound of vehicles approaching saved her from having to answer. The SEAL team arrived in a convoy of trucks, their movements showing the focused energy of operators who knew they had unfinished business. Commander Merrick's vehicle was among them, his continued presence emphasizing the importance of these qualifications and the consequences of failure. Brennan gathered his team near the firing line, his expression serious as he addressed them. Today we finish what we started. The advanced qualification standard stands at 1,500 meters, and we need solid performance across the board. Deployment window doesn't wait for perfect conditions, so we work with what we have. Drummond stepped forward, his rifle already prepped and ready, his face showing the determination of someone who understood his performance would set the tone for everyone else. He was the team's most experienced designated marksman, the benchmark against which others would measure themselves. "Chief," he said, his voice carrying clearly, "I reviewed yesterday's data all night. I think I've figured out the compensation pattern for the Mirage and thermals." "Good," Brennan replied. "You're first up. Show us how it's done." Kira moved to her observation position, while behind the firing line, as always, her spotting scope already set up and focused on the distant target. From this position, she could see both the shooter and the target, tracking the complete arc of each attempt with a trained eye that missed nothing. Drummond settled into position, his movements deliberate and professional. His spotter, experienced SEAL named Phillips, called environmental conditions with practiced precision. Wind is 6 knots at 275 degrees. Temperature Onezaratwo and rising. Pressure holding steady at 21.5. The first shot broke with a clean crack that echoed across the range. Through her scope, Kira watched the bullet's trace and impact, seeing immediately that Drummond had overcorrected for the thermal layer, his compensation too aggressive for the current conditions. "Miss High," Phillips called. "0.4 mils. Drummond adjusted, his second shot connecting but catching the target's lower edge, barely qualifying as a hit. The third shot was better, closer to center mass, but his group was showing the inconsistency that came from fighting conditions he couldn't quite read accurately. Behind her, Kira heard Cortez speaking quietly to another SEAL. "He's struggling. If Drummond can't nail this consistently, the rest of us are in trouble." His companion muttered something inaudible, his tone carrying the frustration of watching their best shooter fight for performance that should come more naturally. Drummond completed his string with 3 solid hits and 2 marginal impacts, a passing score, but not the dominant performance everyone had hoped to see. He cleared the line with visible frustration, his jaw tight as he conferred with Phillips about the environmental calls. "Martinez, you're up," Brennan announced, moving down his roster with a methodical progression that would see every team member tested. The morning progressed with the same challenging pattern, each shooter wrestling with conditions that refused to cooperate, environmental variables that compounded into equations that were difficult to solve in real time. Kira moved between target verification and observation, her role as invisible technician keeping her separate from the tension building among the command element. During a brief pause while they reset targets, she overheard Commander Merrick speaking with Brennan, their voices low but carrying in the desert air. "These scores are marginal at best," Merrick said, his tone conveying the weight of command decisions. "We need better than marginal for the missions you're facing downrange." "I know, sir." Brennan's frustration was evident. These men are solid operators, but these conditions are exposing limitations in their environmental reading capabilities. Then we need to address those limitations. Merrick's voice was firm, because the enemy won't care about challenging conditions. Kira completed her target verification and returned to observation, passing close enough to the firing line to hear Johnson speaking with Martinez. "Man, I don't know what I'm missing," Johnson said, his voice tight. "I'm calling the wind right, compensating for the Mirage, but something's still off. Maybe we should ask the range tech," Martinez replied with bitter humor. "She seems to know where all the impacts are going before they even happen." Johnson laughed without real humor. "Yeah, right. She probably couldn't hit a barn from inside the barn." The casual dismissal was automatic, reflexive, born from assumptions so deep they never questioned them. Kira moved past without acknowledgement, her face neutral, her mind cataloging the mistakes they were making, seeing the subtle corrections they needed but would never think to ask her about. The temperature climbed toward triple digits, the heat building into the oppressive intensity that made every physical movement an effort. The mirage thickened, dancing across the range in waves that distorted distance and created optical illusions that challenged even experienced shooters. Phillips took his turn at the firing line, his performance slightly better than others, but still showing the struggle against conditions that seemed determined to humble every operator who faced them. When he completed his string, Brennan called another brief halt, gathering his team for impromptu instruction. "Listen up," the chief said, his voice carrying the authority of hard-won experience. "The mirage is creating vertical distortion that's affecting your elevation calls. You need to focus through it, pick a clear moment, and break your shot in the stable window." From her position behind the line, Kira could see the flaw in his instruction. The mirage wasn't just creating distortion, it was indicating the thermal behavior that was causing the actual trajectory deviation. Focusing through it wouldn't help if they didn't understand what the mirage was telling them about the air the bullet was traveling through. But she said nothing, maintaining the invisible anonymity that kept her safe from the expectations and pressure she'd fled. The SEALs continued their qualification attempts, struggling against challenges they couldn't quite decode, while the range tech, who could have explained it all, stood silent and unremarked upon, exactly as dismissed as they believed her to be. The morning stretched toward noon, and the qualification session continued its pattern of marginal performance and mounting frustration, each shot emphasizing the gap between capability and conditions, each miss reinforcing the uncertainty that deployment readiness was supposed to eliminate. By 1300, Commander Merrick had seen enough. He called Brennan aside for a private conversation that everyone pretended not to watch, their body language conveying the seriousness of whatever discussion was taking place. When they returned to the firing line, Merrick's expression was set with the firmness of command decisions that wouldn't be negotiated. "Chief Brennan, effective immediately, we're implementing an extended qualification period," Merrick announced, his voice carrying across the range with the authority that came from decades of service. "Your team has 72 hours to achieve passing scores across the board. After that, we'll need to have serious discussions about deployment readiness and potential roster changes." The weight of those words settled over the SEAL team like a physical presence. Roster changes meant operators being pulled from their teams, careers derailed, deployment slots given to others. It was the kind of consequence that made marginal performance unacceptable. "Understood, sir," Brennan replied, his jaw tight. "We'll get it done. I know you will." Merrick's tone softened slightly. "These are good operators, Chief. They just need to figure out these conditions. Find a way to help them see what they're missing." After Merrick departed, the atmosphere on the range shifted into something more tense, more urgent. The qualification had transformed from important to critical, from career-affecting to potentially career-ending. Kira could see it in the way the SEALs moved, the tightness in their shoulders, the focused intensity that came from operators facing consequences they couldn't afford. "All right, listen up," Brennan called his team together, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood what failure would mean for everyone. "We have 3 days to crack this. I want everyone reviewing data books, studying environmental patterns, doing everything possible to improve performance. Chief, what if we bring in an outside consultant?" Martinez suggested, his frustration evident. "Someone who specializes in extreme range shooting in desert conditions?" Brennan shook his head. "No time. Anyone qualified enough to help is either deployed or has a waiting list months long. We solve this ourselves with what we have." Cortez glanced around the range, his eyes passing over Kira without really seeing her. "What about getting better equipment? Maybe the rifles need adjustment?" "The rifles are fine," Drummond interjected, his tone sharp. "This isn't equipment failure. We're missing something in how we're reading these conditions." Kira continued her duties, securing targets and organizing equipment, her movements taking her close enough to hear the continuing discussion among the team members. "I've shot in desert conditions before," Johnson said, his voice carrying a defensive edge. "But nothing like this. It's like the environment is actively working against us." His companion, a SEAL named Wallace, nodded agreement. "Every time I think I've got the compensation figured out, something shifts and the shot goes somewhere unexpected. Maybe we're overthinking it," Phillips suggested, trying to account for too many variables instead of trusting fundamentals. The conversation continued, each operator offering theories and suggestions, all of them circling around the problem without quite identifying the core issue. Kira listened while organizing paint supplies, her trained ear recognizing that they were treating symptoms rather than addressing the underlying cause of their struggles. As the afternoon wore on, Brennan implemented a modified training approach, having shooters work in pairs with extended time to study conditions before each shot. The pace slowed, the pressure remained constant, and the performance showed only marginal improvement. During a water break, Kira found herself near Cortland at the equipment shed. He was reviewing maintenance logs, but his attention seemed divided. "They're missing the relationship between the mirage behavior and the thermal layer," she said quietly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "They're treating them as separate variables instead of understanding how one indicates the other." Cortland looked up sharply, his weathered face showing surprise and something else, a growing recognition that had been building since their conversation the previous day. "That's not basic range tech knowledge, Vance. That's expert-level environmental reading." She felt the familiar tension of having revealed too much, but the frustration of watching skilled operators struggle with something she could explain had finally broken through her careful restraint. "I know," she said simply. "So the question is, why is someone with expert-level knowledge working as a range tech?" He studied her with the intensity of someone reassessing everything he thought he knew. "And more importantly, why are you staying silent while watching them struggle?" The question hung between them, cutting through the anonymity she'd maintained so carefully. Before she could formulate a response, Brennan's voice called across the range. "Cortland, need you up here. We're discussing tomorrow's training plan." The moment passed, Cortland giving her a long look before heading toward the command element. Kira released a breath, her hands slightly unsteady as she returned to organizing equipment. The careful boundaries she'd maintained were eroding, her expertise becoming visible to those who paid attention. The afternoon session continued until 1700, each shooter completing multiple attempts with results that showed slight improvement but remained frustratingly inconsistent. When Brennan finally called the day's training complete, the exhaustion was evident in every face, the weight of the 7-Titwohor deadline pressing on everyone. Kira secured the range through the evening routine, her movements automatic while her mind wrestled with the implications of her conversation with Cortland. She'd come here to be invisible, to escape the pressure and expectations of competitive shooting, to exist without the constant performance demands that had finally broken her. But watching skilled operators struggle with conditions she understood intimately was creating its own kind of pressure, a different tension that came from having knowledge that could help but choosing to remain silent. The old instincts that had driven her to national rankings and international competitions were pressing against the careful anonymity she'd constructed. As she completed the final equipment checks, she heard voices from near the parking area. Several SEALs had gathered around their trucks, their conversation carrying in the evening air. 3 days, Cortez said, his voice tight with stress. 3 days to figure out what we've been missing, or we're facing roster changes and everything that comes with it. We'll get there, Drummond replied, though his tone carried less certainty than his words. We have to. Man, I'd give anything for someone who could just explain what we're doing wrong, Martinez added with bitter frustration. Someone who really understands these conditions and can break it down in a way that makes sense. Maybe we should ask the target girl, Wallace said with a laugh that carried no real humor. I'm sure she's got all kinds of expert advice for us. They all laughed, the sound hollow and tired, the mockery automatic even through their exhaustion. Kira stood in the shadow of the equipment shed, listening to them dismiss the one person on the range who could answer their questions, and felt the bitter irony of her situation settling heavily on her shoulders. She finished securing the range and drove back to her apartment through the desert darkness, the familiar route giving her time to process the day's tensions. In her sparse living room, she sat with a cup of tea and stared at the blank wall, wrestling with decisions she'd thought were settled 18 months ago. The SEALs needed help. They were skilled operators facing conditions that exposed gaps in their training, and they had 72 hours to close those gaps or face consequences that would affect their careers and their team's readiness. She had the knowledge they needed, the expertise that could explain what they were missing. But revealing that expertise meant revealing herself, stepping back into the world of performance and expectations she'd worked so hard to escape. It meant becoming visible again, acknowledged as a shooter rather than a technician, subjected to the questions and pressures she'd fled. The night stretched around her, silent and dark, while she sat alone with a weight of knowledge she wasn't sure she was willing to share. Tomorrow would bring another day of watching them struggle, another day of maintaining the anonymity that protected her from everything she'd been. The choice pressed against her like the desert heat, demanding and inescapable, asking her to decide who she was willing to be and what price she was willing to pay for remaining invisible. The second day of the extended qualification period began with a pre-dawn briefing, Brennan gathering his team in the dim light before sunrise to review strategy and adjust their approach. Kira arrived early as always, preparing the range while listening to the intensity in their voices, the urgency that came from watching their deadline shrink from 72 hours to 48. "We're going to approach this systematically," Brennan announced, his voice carrying across the pre-dawn darkness. "Extended observation periods before each shot. Detailed environmental logging. Every piece of data gets recorded and analyzed." The team dispersed to prepare equipment, their movements showing the focused determination of operators who understood the stakes. As the sun rose, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber, the qualification attempts resumed with renewed intensity. Drummond took first position, his rifle steady on its bipod, his focus absolute. Phillips called conditions with meticulous precision, their partnership refined through years of working together. The shot broke clean, and through her spotting scope, Kira watched it impact high and left, missing center mass by a margin that would have been acceptable in easier conditions, but here represented another frustrating near miss. "Point 3 high, point 2 left," Phillips called. "Compensate and repeat." The pattern continued through the morning, each shooter demonstrating solid fundamentals, but struggling with the environmental variables that turned theoretical knowledge into practical challenges. The mirage danced, the thermals shifted, and the wind gusted unpredictably, creating a combination that demanded expertise most of them hadn't yet developed. During a break between shooters, Kira was resetting the 1,200-meter target when she heard voices approaching. Martinez and Johnson were walking the range, studying the terrain with the intensity of operators trying to decode a puzzle. "There has to be something we're missing," Martinez said, frustration evident in his voice. "Some pattern or indicator we're not seeing." Johnson shook his head, his expression showing the wear of 2 days of struggle. "I've studied my data book until I can recite it in my sleep. The numbers are solid, but something about these conditions is throwing everything off." They passed close enough that Kira could have spoken, could have pointed out the relationship between the mirage patterns and the thermal layer behavior, could have explained the ground heating effects that were creating the vertical component they kept missing. But she remained silent, maintaining the invisible anonymity that kept her separate from their world. "Hey, target girl," Martinez called out suddenly, his tone carrying that casual dismissiveness she'd learned to expect. "You spend all day out here watching. Notice anything useful about these conditions?" The question caught her off guard, the first time any of them had asked her opinion on anything beyond technical logistics. She could deflect, give a non-answer that maintained her cover, or she could offer something genuine that might actually help. The mirage intensity correlates with the thermal layer strength, she said carefully, keeping her voice neutral. When the mirage is strongest, you're seeing the most vertical push from ground heating. Martinez blinked, his expression shifting from dismissive to confused. What? The heat coming off the ground creates rising air currents, she continued, feeling herself step on a dangerous ground but unable to stop now that she'd started. The mirage shows you where those currents are strongest. When you see heavy mirage, you need to account for additional vertical compensation beyond your standard elevation calls. Johnson studied her with new attention, his earlier dismissiveness giving way to something more thoughtful. That's pretty specific knowledge for a range tech. You pick things up, she replied, the familiar deflection coming automatically. When you watch enough shots and see the patterns. Martinez exchanged a glance with Johnson, something shifting in their perception. Maybe we should have asked you sooner. They moved on, leaving Kira with the uncomfortable awareness that her careful anonymity was continuing to erode. The simple act of offering useful information had changed how they saw her, transformed her from invisible background element to someone who might actually know something valuable. The morning progressed with the team implementing various adjustments to their shooting approach, some effective and others less so. Cortland found Kira during the midday break, his expression carrying the weight of decisions being considered. "Brennan asked me about you," he said without preamble. "Wanted to know your background, how long you've been here, what experience you have." "What did you tell him?" Kira kept her voice steady despite the tension coiling in her chest. "I told him you're the best range tech we've had in years, and that you seem to understand shooting better than most people I've worked with." He paused, studying her face. "I also told him that if he wants to know more, he should ask you directly." The implication was clear. Cortland had protected her privacy while making it known that there was more to her story than the role she'd been playing. It was both a courtesy and a challenge, giving her space to maintain her anonymity while suggesting that continued silence might not be the best choice. Before she could respond, Brennan's voice called across the range. "All personnel, gather at the firing line. Need to discuss afternoon approach." The team assembled, their faces showing the strain of 2 days of intense effort without the breakthrough they needed. Brennan stood before them, his expression serious in the harsh midday sun. "We're at the halfway point of our deadline," he said, his voice carrying the weight of command responsibility. "Performance has improved marginally, but we're not where we need to be. I need everyone thinking creatively about solutions." "Chief," Drummond spoke up, his frustration evident. "We've tried every adjustment we can think of. Different dope calculations, extended observation periods, modified shooting techniques. Something about these conditions is just beyond our current expertise." "Then we need to find that expertise," Brennan replied. "Whatever it takes." "Sir," Martinez interjected, his tone hesitant. "The range tech, Vance, she mentioned something earlier about mirage patterns indicating thermal behavior. It was pretty advanced ballistic knowledge." All eyes turned toward where Kira stood at the edge of the group, suddenly visible in a way she hadn't been for 18 months. Brennan's gaze focused on her with new intensity, assessing rather than overlooking. "Vance, is that accurate? Did you provide ballistic guidance to Martinez?" She felt the moment crystallizing around her, the decision point she'd been avoiding suddenly unavoidable. "I mentioned the relationship between mirage and thermal layers," she said carefully. "Basic environmental observation." "That's not basic," Drummond said, his tone sharp. "That's expert-level understanding of how environmental factors affect trajectory." "Where did you learn that?" The question hung in the air, demanding an answer that would either maintain her cover or shatter it completely. Every member of the team was watching her now, really seeing her for the first time, their earlier dismissiveness giving way to something more complicated. "I used to shoot competitively," she said finally, the admission feeling like stepping off a cliff. "Long time ago." "What level?" Brennan's voice was direct, cutting through any possibility of vague deflection. "National level. Some international competitions." The words felt strange after 18 months of silence, like claiming an identity she'd deliberately discarded. The SEALs exchanged glances, their expressions shifting through surprise, confusion, and a growing recognition that they'd been fundamentally wrong about who she was. Cortez actually laughed, though the sound carried more disbelief than humor. "You're telling us the target girl is a national-level competitive shooter?" His tone was incredulous. "And you've been watching us struggle for 2 days without saying anything?" "It's not my place," Kira replied, feeling defensive despite herself. "I'm here to maintain targets, not to provide shooting instruction." Brennan stepped forward, his expression intense. "Vance, I need you to be completely honest with me. Can you explain what we're doing wrong? Can you help us understand these conditions well enough to pass qualification?" The question was direct, unavoidable, demanding a choice she couldn't deflect. She could retreat back into anonymity, maintain that she was just a range tech who happened to have some background knowledge, or she could acknowledge the full extent of her expertise and everything that came with it. "Yes," she said quietly, "I can explain what you're missing, but that's not what you really need." "Then what do we need?" Brennan's voice was sharp with urgency and the pressure of his deadline. Kira met his eyes steadily, feeling herself commit to a path she'd avoided for 18 months. "You need to see it demonstrated. You need someone to make the shot under these conditions and then explain exactly how they did it. Theory only gets you so far." The implications settled over the group, and she saw understanding dawning on their faces. Brennan's expression shifted through calculation to decision. "Can you make the shot?" The question was blunt, challenging. 1,500 meters in these conditions. First round hit? The old confidence stirred beneath 18 months of deliberate suppression, muscle memory, and hard-won expertise that hadn't disappeared just because she'd stopped using it. "Yes. Then show us." The words hung in the desert air, challenging and unavoidable. "Show us." Kira felt 18 months of careful anonymity crumbling around her, the protective distance she'd maintained dissolving under the weight of direct challenge and genuine need. Every eye was on her now, skeptical and assessing. The SEALs watching the range tech they dismissed with a mixture of disbelief and desperate hope. "Wait," Cortez said, his voice carrying confusion and something like denial. "You're seriously going to let her shoot? The target girl, who we've been joking about for 2 days? She has national-level competitive experience," Brennan replied, his tone brooking no argument. "Right now, that makes her the most qualified person on this range to demonstrate what we're missing." His gaze fixed on Kira with command intensity. "Unless you're backing down from your claim?" The challenge was clear, and she felt the old competitive fire stirring beneath the careful suppression she'd maintained. "No," she said quietly. "I'm not backing down." Drummond stepped forward, his expression showing calculation mixed with doubt. "Chief, with respect, competitive shooting is different from tactical applications. Paper targets don't shoot back, and competition conditions are controlled. These quals are designed for combat scenarios." "I'm aware of the difference," Kira replied, keeping her voice steady despite the adrenaline starting to course through her system. "But the fundamentals of reading wind, mirage, and thermal effects don't change whether you're on a competition range or in a combat zone. Physics is physics." Martinez laughed, though the sound carried more nervousness than mockery. "This I have to see. The target girl is going to show SEALs how to shoot. She's going to show you how to read these specific conditions," Brennan corrected sharply, "which is exactly what you need to pass qualification." He gestured toward the firing line. "Vance, you're up." Kira moved toward the line, her heart rate elevated, but her hands steady with muscle memory that 18 months hadn't eroded. The familiar pre-shot routine was already engaging, her mind automatically cataloging environmental factors and calculating adjustments with the speed that came from thousands of hours of practice. Drummond approached, holding his rifle with visible reluctance. "You'll use mine. It's zeroed, and I've got detailed dope for the conditions." She took the weapon, feeling its weight and balance, her hands finding the familiar geometry of stock and grip. The rifle was a precision instrument, well-maintained and properly configured, but she could already feel that the zero was slightly off from what she'd prefer. No time to adjust it now. She'd have to account for his zero shift in her calculations. Phillips moved into spotter position automatically, though his expression showed uncertainty about calling for someone he'd been dismissing as incompetent hours earlier. Range is 1,500 meters. Wind is 7 knots at Tawaitzero. Temperature is -06. Mirage is heavy. Kira settled into position behind the rifle, her body remembering the posture and technique that had earned national rankings. She didn't rush, taking time to establish proper bone support and natural point of aim, feeling the weapon settle into the pocket of her shoulder with the rightness of long familiarity. Behind her, she heard Wallace whisper to Johnson. $10, says she doesn't even hit the target frame. You're on, Johnson whispered back, though I'm starting to think we might have seriously underestimated her. Through the scope, the target wavered in the heavy mirage, appearing to float and dance in the heat distortion. Most shooters would fight the mirage, trying to force a clear picture that didn't exist. Kira relaxed into it instead, letting her vision soften slightly, using the mirage pattern itself as information rather than obstacle. She watched the boil and flow of the heat waves, seeing the patterns that indicated thermal strength and vertical component. The wind was steady at 7 knots, but she could see in the mirage behavior that the thermal layer was adding approximately 0.4 mils of vertical push, more than the standard environmental tables would suggest. Her breathing settled into the familiar rhythm, for counts in, for counts out, finding the natural pause where the body was stillest. The rifle sat solid in her grip, her trigger finger finding the precise contact point that allowed for clean break without disturbance. She's taking forever, Cortez muttered. How long does she need to aim? She's reading conditions, Drummond replied quietly, his tone shifting from skeptical to thoughtful. Actually reading them, not just looking at numbers. The wind held steady for 3 seconds, the mirage pattern stabilizing into consistency that would last perhaps 5 seconds total. Kira saw her window, confirmed her hold, and began the smooth rearward press on the trigger that built pressure without jerking, adding force incrementally until the break came as almost a surprise. The rifle cracked, the recoil impulse familiar and expected, already managed through proper body position. She stayed in the scope, tracking the trace for the brief instant before the bullet arrived downrange. Through the mirage and heat, she saw the impact exactly where she'd called it. Hit, Phillips called, his voice cracking slightly with surprise. Dead center mass. Perfect hit. Absolute silence held for 3 full seconds. Then Martinez spoke, his voice carrying awe and disbelief in equal measure. Holy shit. She just nailed a 1,500-meter shot first round in conditions that have been eating us alive for 2 days. Kira cleared the rifle and stood, her legs slightly unsteady from the adrenaline dump that came with performance under pressure. The SEALs were staring at her with expressions that ranged from shocked to calculating to something approaching respect. Explain what you did, Brennan said, his command voice cutting through the stunned silence. Step by step, everything that went into that shot. She took a breath, organizing her thoughts into something teachable. The mirage pattern showed me the thermal layer strength. When you see that heavy boil and flow, it's not just visual distortion. It's indicating rising air currents that will push your bullet vertically. I added 0.4 mils of drop compensation beyond what the standard ballistic calculator suggested. But how did you know it was 0.4 specifically? Drummond asked, his earlier skepticism giving way to genuine interest. That's incredibly precise estimation. Pattern recognition from experience, she replied. I've shot in these conditions hundreds of times. You learn to correlate mirage behavior with trajectory deviation. The specific flow pattern I saw indicated that strength of thermal layer. What about the wind? Johnson interjected. You held for 7 knots, but the trace looked like you anticipated a gust. I saw it coming in the mirage movement, Kira explained. The pattern shifted slightly left about 2 seconds before I broke the shot, indicating wind increase. I adjusted hold accordingly and timed my break for when conditions stabilized. Martinez shook his head slowly, his expression showing the cognitive dissonance of watching assumptions shatter. We've been looking at mirage as a problem to overcome. You're using it as information. Exactly, She confirmed. The mirage is telling you everything you need to know about what the air is doing between you and the target. You just have to learn to read it. Brennan stepped forward, his weathered face showing calculation and decision. Vance, I need you to explain this to every shooter. Demonstrate again if necessary. Break down every aspect of reading these conditions until everyone understands it. Chief, I'm not an instructor, she protested, feeling the familiar pressure of expectations starting to build. I'm here to maintain targets. Right now, you're the difference between my team passing qualification and facing roster changes, Brennan replied flatly. So right now, you're whatever I need you to be. He gestured toward the assembled SEALs. These are professional operators who need to learn what you know. Are you willing to teach them? The question carried weight beyond the immediate tactical need. Teaching meant acknowledging her expertise publicly, stepping fully into visibility she'd avoided, accepting a role that came with performance expectations and pressure. It meant surrendering the anonymity that had protected her from everything she'd fled. But looking at the faces around her, seeing skilled operators who genuinely needed help and were now willing to listen, she felt something shift in her carefully maintained distance. Maybe being invisible wasn't the same as being safe. Maybe hiding her expertise was its own kind of pressure. Yes, she said finally. I'll teach them. Cortez approached, his earlier mockery completely absent from his expression. I owe you an apology. We all do. We've been treating you like you didn't know which end the bullets come out of, and you're better than any of us. Kira felt the weight of his words, the acknowledgement of how thoroughly they'd underestimated her. Don't apologize yet. Let's see if I can actually help you pass these quals. You already did, Drummond said quietly, his gaze thoughtful. That one shot taught me more about reading these conditions than 2 days of struggling taught me. Now we just need to understand it well enough to replicate it. The afternoon stretched ahead, and Kira stood at the firing line, surrounded by operators who now saw her completely differently, waiting for her to explain expertise she'd kept hidden for 18 months. The protective anonymity was gone, but something else was emerging in its place, something that felt almost like purpose. The afternoon transformed into an intensive teaching session, Kira finding herself at the center of a circle of SEALs who now hung on her every word with the focus of operators who understood their careers depended on absorbing what she was explaining. The shift from dismissed background element to acknowledged expert was disorienting, but the familiar rhythm of breaking down complex concepts into teachable components came back with surprising ease. All right, she began, standing near the firing line with the assembled team gathered close. Everything you've been taught about reading Mirage is technically correct, but incomplete. You've learned to see it as distortion to fight through. I need you to start seeing it as data to interpret. She gestured toward the shimmering air downrange. Look at the flow pattern right now. See how it's boiling up in consistent waves? That's not random. That specific pattern indicates a thermal layer approximately 1.12 meters above the ground, strength sufficient to create vertical push on your trajectory. Phillips, acting as the team's primary spotter, studied the Mirage with new intensity. So we should be adding elevation to compensate. Yes, but not using standard tables, Kira explained. The tables assume average thermal conditions. What you're seeing right now is stronger than average. In these specific conditions, at 1,500 meters, you need to add approximately 0.4 mils beyond your calculated drop. But how do we know when it's 0.4 versus some other value? Martinez asked, his frustration evident. That seems like guesswork. It's pattern recognition built from experience, she replied. But I can give you shortcuts. See how the Mirage appears to rise in distinct pulses rather than a steady shimmer? That pulsing indicates strong thermals. Steady shimmer means moderate conditions. When you can barely see any Mirage, thermals are minimal. Drummond was taking detailed notes, his earlier skepticism completely transformed into focused attention. So we're essentially using Mirage behavior as a thermometer for air density effects. Exactly, Kira confirmed. The Mirage is showing you what the air is doing, and the air is what your bullet travels through. Read one, understand the other. She spent the next 2 hours working with each shooter individually, having them observe mirage patterns and articulate what they were seeing before making adjustments. The progression was methodical and demanding, but she could see comprehension beginning to dawn in their expressions as abstract theory connected with observable reality. Wallace took position for a practice shot, his movements showing new deliberation as he applied the concepts. He studied the mirage for nearly a minute, longer than he'd taken for any previous attempt, his focus absolute. "I'm seeing strong pulsing pattern," he announced. "Indicates strong thermals. Wind is holding at 6 knots. I'm adding 0.35 mils for thermal compensation." "Good analysis," Kira confirmed. "But watch the left edge of your mirage field. See that slight shift in the pattern? That's a wind change building. I'd wait 5 seconds for it to stabilize." Wallace held position, watching, and sure enough the mirage pattern shifted as a gust moved through. He waited for it to settle, made a final adjustment, and broke his shot. The impact was solid center mass, his best hit of the entire qualification period. Yes, he cleared the rifle with visible excitement. That's what I've been missing, actually reading what the conditions are doing instead of guessing. Johnson took his turn next, applying the same methodical observation before shooting. His first shot was high, but Kira immediately saw the error in his compensation calculation. "You're still using the standard thermal table instead of trusting what the mirage is showing you. Let's try again with more aggressive compensation." His second attempt connected cleanly, and she watched his expression transform as understanding clicked into place. "This changes everything," he said quietly. 2 days of struggling, and now it suddenly makes sense. By late afternoon, every member of the team had successfully connected on multiple shots using the enhanced environmental reading techniques. The improvement was dramatic and consistent, transforming marginal performance into solid capability. Brennan observed the progression with visible satisfaction, his tactical mind already calculating how this knowledge would translate to operational readiness. As the training session wound down, Cortland approached Kira with an expression that mixed approval with something like vindication. "I knew there was more to you than you were showing. The question is, why hide it?" The familiar tension returned, the question touching on everything she'd been avoiding for 18 months. Competitive shooting stopped being something I loved and started being something that was killing me, she said quietly. The pressure, the expectations, the constant performance demands. I needed to step away, and becoming invisible seemed like the best way to do it. "So you buried national-level expertise and spent 18 months hauling targets?" Cortland's tone carried disbelief. "That's one hell of a sacrifice." "It was supposed to be peaceful," she replied. "Turned out watching people struggle with something you could help with creates its own kind of pressure." "Well, you're not invisible anymore," he observed. "Not after what you demonstrated today. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Before she could respond, Brennan's voice called across the range. "All personnel, gather up. Need to discuss tomorrow's plan." The team assembled, their body language dramatically different from the tense frustration that had marked the previous days. There was energy now, confidence built on genuine understanding rather than desperate hope. "Outstanding work today," Brennan said, his command voice carrying approval. "Performance improved dramatically once you understood what Vance was teaching. Tomorrow we run full qualification attempts using these enhanced environmental reading techniques." He turned to Kira directly. "Vance, I need you on the line tomorrow providing real-time guidance during qualification attempts. Your expertise might be the difference between passing and failing." The request felt like a door opening, inviting her back into a world she'd deliberately left. But the operators around her weren't asking her to compete or perform, just to share knowledge that could help them succeed. Maybe that was different enough to matter. "I'll be there," she confirmed. As the team dispersed to their vehicles, several SEALs approached Kira individually to thank her or ask additional questions. Martinez was particularly earnest, his earlier mockery completely absent. "I need to apologize more specifically," he said, meeting her eyes directly. "The comments I made about you not knowing which end bullets come out of, that was ignorant and disrespectful. You're a better shooter than I'll probably ever be, and you handled our dismissiveness with more professionalism than we deserved. Kira felt something loosen in her chest at his genuine acknowledgement. Apology accepted. For what it's worth, you're all solid shooters. You just needed someone to explain these specific conditions. Still, he persisted. We treated you like you were incompetent, and you responded by helping us when we desperately needed it. That says a lot about your character. After the last vehicle departed, Kira stood alone on the range in the fading light, processing everything that had shifted in a single afternoon. The careful anonymity she'd maintained was gone, shattered by a single demonstration shot and the teaching session that followed. Everyone now knew she was far more than a range tech, and there was no path back to invisibility. But standing there in the desert evening, surrounded by the familiar geometry of targets and firing lines, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 18 months. Not pressure or expectation or the crushing weight of performance demands, but something simpler and cleaner. Purpose. The satisfaction of expertise applied to help people who genuinely needed it. Maybe there was a version of involvement that didn't require competition or performance on her own behalf. Maybe teaching and helping others could let her use her knowledge without surrendering herself to the destructive pressure that had driven her away from competitive shooting. The sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, while she secured the range and prepared for the critical day ahead. Tomorrow would bring the real test, not of her own capability, but of whether she could successfully transfer that capability to operators who needed it for mission success. She drove home through the gathering darkness, her mind already planning how to structure the guidance and support the team would need. The protective distance was gone, but something else was emerging in its place, something that felt almost like healing. Not a return to what she'd been, but perhaps a path toward what she might become. The apartment that had felt like a refuge now felt like a waypoint, temporary rather than permanent. She made dinner, reviewed her notes about each shooter's specific challenges, and prepared for the demanding day ahead. Somewhere in the transition from invisible to acknowledged, from hidden to helpful, she'd crossed a threshold she hadn't anticipated. The question was whether this new path would lead somewhere worth going, or whether stepping back into visibility would resurrect all the pressure she'd fled. Tomorrow would begin answering that question, one qualification attempt at a time. The third day dawned with different energy, the desperate tension of previous mornings replaced by focused determination built on genuine understanding. Kira arrived at the range to find the SEAL team already present, several of them studying the mirage patterns with the intentional observation she taught them, their body language showing concentration rather than frustrated confusion. Brennan gathered everyone for a brief before the formal qualification attempts began. Today we execute what we learned yesterday. Vance will be available for consultation, but the shots are yours to make. Commander Merrick will be here at On and 100 to observe, and we need to demonstrate that yesterday's breakthrough translates to consistent performance. The weight of the deadline hung over everything. The final 24 hours of their 7 Titwahur extension ticking away with inexorable pressure. Careers and deployment readiness balanced on their ability to apply new knowledge under evaluation conditions that allowed no room for failure. Drummond approached Kira as the team prepared equipment, his expression serious but no longer skeptical. I need to ask you something. When you were competing at national level, how did you handle the pressure? The knowledge that everything depended on performance in the moment? The question cut close to wounds that hadn't fully healed, touching on exactly what had driven her away from competition. I didn't handle it well, she admitted. Eventually, the pressure became more powerful than the love of shooting, and that's when I knew I needed to step away. But you made that shot yesterday, he persisted. Perfect first-round hit with all of us watching, your credibility on the line. That's pressure, and you handled it. That was different, Kira said, trying to articulate a distinction she was still processing herself. Yesterday wasn't about my performance. It was about helping you understand something you needed to know. The pressure was there, but it wasn't about me proving my worth or meeting expectations. It was about being useful. Drummond nodded slowly, absorbing her words. Maybe that's what I need to remember today. It's not about proving anything. It's about executing what I now understand. Exactly, she confirmed. You know how to read these conditions now. Trust that knowledge and let it work. Commander Merrick arrived precisely at 100, his presence adding weight to the already charged atmosphere. He conferred briefly with Brennan, then took position at the observation point where he could evaluate the proceedings with the critical eye of someone who would make career-affecting decisions based on what he witnessed. Brennan called the team to order, his voice carrying across the range with command authority. First shooter is Drummond. Range is 1,500 meters. Standard qualification protocol applies. He glanced at Kira, giving her a slight nod of acknowledgement before focusing back on his operator. You may begin when ready. Drummond settled into position with the deliberate care of someone who understood exactly what depended on this performance. Phillips took his place as spotter, their partnership refined through years of working together, now enhanced with the improved environmental reading capabilities Kira had taught them. Wind is 5 knots at Tusavenzaro, Phillips announced. Temperature, Onezra 4. Mirage shows moderate to strong thermal activity. Drummond studied the mirage pattern for nearly 30 seconds, longer than he would have taken 3 days ago, his observation methodical and thorough. Through her spotting scope, Kira watched him process information with the enhanced understanding that came from knowing what to look for. I'm reading moderate thermal push based on mirage flow pattern, Drummond called, adding 0.3 mils for thermal compensation beyond calculated drop. The shot broke clean, and the impact was solid center mass. Phillips confirmed the hit with a voice that carried satisfaction and relief. Dead center. Excellent shot. Drummond worked through his qualification string with methodical precision, each shot demonstrating the application of enhanced environmental reading. His final group was tight and consistent, well within passing standards. When he cleared the line, the tension in his shoulders had transformed into quiet confidence. Outstanding performance, Brennan said, making notes on his evaluation sheet. That's the standard we need from everyone today. Martinez took position next, his movements showing the focus of an operator who understood the stakes. He executed his mirage analysis with careful attention, verbalizing his observations before making adjustments. His performance matched Drummond's quality, consistent hits that demonstrated genuine comprehension rather than lucky guessing. The morning progressed with each shooter applying the techniques Kira had taught. Their performance dramatically improved from the struggles of previous days. Commander Merrick observed without comment, his weathered face revealing nothing of his assessment, but Kira could see him making detailed notes on his tablet. Johnson's turn came mid-morning, and she watched him settle into position with visible determination. He was one of the shooters who'd struggled most in the early qualification attempts, his frustration evident as conditions consistently defeated his efforts. Now he studied the mirage with the patient attention of someone who understood what he was observing. Seeing strong pulsing in the mirage pattern, he announced, indicates significant thermal layer. Wind is steady at 6 knots. I'm compensating 0.4 mils for thermal effects. His first shot impacted high, missing the qualification zone. Kira saw the error immediately, watching his body language shift toward the familiar frustration that had marked previous attempts. She moved closer to his position, keeping her voice low enough that only he could hear. You read the conditions perfectly, she said quietly. The miss was trigger control, not environmental miscalculation. You jerked slightly on the brake. Reset, trust your analysis, and focus on smooth trigger press. Johnson took a breath, visibly steadying himself. His second shot connected cleanly, center mass, and she watched confidence return to his posture. The remaining shots in his string were solid, demonstrating that the first miss had been mechanical error rather than environmental misreading. When he cleared the line, he approached Kira directly. Thank you, not just for the technical help, but for understanding that I needed encouragement more than correction. That's what coaching is, she replied, surprised at how natural the role felt. Seeing what people need in the moment and providing it. Wallace took his turn, then Cortez, each shooter demonstrating improved capability that translated previous days' learning into qualification performance. The consistency was remarkable, the transformation from struggling operators to confident performers visible in every aspect of their execution. During a brief break while targets were verified and reset, Commander Merrick approached Kira directly. His expression was unreadable, the neutral assessment of a senior officer evaluating something unexpected. "Vance, I understand you provided the breakthrough instruction that enabled this improvement. Chief Brennan gave me the details about your background and your demonstration shot." "Yes, sir," she confirmed, feeling suddenly aware that her carefully maintained anonymity had reached the highest levels of the command structure. That was national-level competitive shooting experience? His tone was neutral but probing. "Yes, sir. Multiple national championships, some international competition placements. I competed for about 8 years before leaving the sport. And you've been working as a range tech here for 18 months? Merrick's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's the significant departure from national-level competition. I needed distance from the competitive environment," she said carefully. The pressure became counterproductive. This job offered technical work without performance demands. Merrick studied her for a long moment, his experienced eyes seeing more than she was comfortable revealing. "Well, you may have left competition, but you clearly didn't lose your expertise. What you've taught my operators in 2 days would have taken months to develop through trial and error. That's valuable capability." "Thank you, sir," she replied, uncertain where this conversation was heading. He glanced toward the firing line where the next shooter was preparing. "We'll discuss this further after qualifications conclude. Right now, I need to finish evaluating these performances." The afternoon session continued with the remaining shooters executing their qualification attempts. The performance was consistently strong, each operator demonstrating genuine mastery of the enhanced environmental reading techniques. By 1600, every team member had achieved passing scores, many of them with margins that exceeded the minimum standards significantly. Brennan gathered the team for final assessment, his expression showing satisfaction that went beyond professional approval. "Outstanding work across the board. You took new knowledge, internalized it, and executed under pressure. That's exactly what operational readiness requires." He turned to Kira, his weathered face showing something that might have been gratitude. "Vance, your instruction made the difference between failure and success for this team. I want to acknowledge that publicly and ensure everyone understands the debt we owe you." The team erupted in applause, spontaneous and genuine, the SEALs showing respect and appreciation that erased every dismissive comment from previous days. Kira felt the weight of their acknowledgement, unexpected and overwhelming, recognition from operators whose respect meant something real. Commander Merrick stepped forward, his command presence silencing the group. "I've observed 3 days of qualification attempts, and what I witnessed today represents one of the most dramatic performance improvements I've seen in 30 years of service. Chief Brennan, your team is certified for deployment." The relief was palpable, tension releasing in waves across the assembled operators. But Merrick wasn't finished. "Vance, I'd like to speak with you privately before I depart." The statement was polite, but carried the weight of command that made it non-optional. As the team dispersed to secure equipment and celebrate their success, Kira felt uncertainty settling over the satisfaction of having helped them succeed. Whatever Merrick wanted to discuss, it would force decisions about who she was willing to become and what price she was willing to pay for stepping back into visibility. Commander Merrick waited until the range had cleared, the SEAL team departing with the satisfied energy of operators who'd overcome a critical challenge. Only Cortland remained, securing equipment at a respectful distance, while Merrick gestured for Kira to join him near the observation point overlooking the empty firing line. The desert stretched vast and quiet around them, the late afternoon sun painting long shadows across the range complex. Merrick studied the distant targets for a moment before turning his full attention to her, his weathered face carrying the assessment of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected careers and capabilities. I've made some inquiries since Chief Brennan informed me of your background. He began without preamble. Kira Vance, former competitive shooter. 3 national championships in precision rifle competition. International placements, including a 4th-place finish at the World Championships 2 years ago. Then you disappeared from the circuit completely with no explanation. The summary of her former life felt strange hearing it spoken aloud after 18 months of deliberate anonymity. She said nothing, waiting to see where this was leading. That level of achievement doesn't happen by accident, Merrick continued. You were ranked in the top 20 shooters globally, male or female, in one of the most demanding disciplines in competitive shooting. People don't walk away from that kind of success without significant reason. Kira felt the familiar tension of being seen too clearly, her carefully constructed distance penetrated by someone who understood excellence and the cost that came with it. The pressure became unsustainable, she said finally. When the fear of failing becomes stronger than the joy of competing, it's time to step away. Merrick nodded slowly, recognition in his expression. I've seen that happen to good operators. The weight of expectations becomes its own enemy. But here's what interests me about your situation. You didn't just step away from competition. You buried your expertise completely, took a position where you were systematically underestimated and dismissed, and maintained that cover for 18 months. It was supposed to be peaceful, she replied, hearing the defensive edge in her own voice. Technical work without performance demands. A way to stay connected to shooting without the pressure that was destroying me. And how did that work out? His tone was neutral but probing. Was watching skilled operators struggle with knowledge you possessed actually peaceful? The question cut directly to the tension she'd been wrestling with since Brennan had challenged her to demonstrate her capability. No, she admitted quietly. It created its own kind of pressure. Different from competition, but still uncomfortable. Because expertise in use becomes its own burden, Merrick observed. Especially when you see people who could benefit from what you know. He paused, studying her face with the intensity of someone making critical assessments. Which brings me to why I wanted this conversation. The instruction you provided over the past 2 days was exceptional. Not just technically sound, but pedagogically effective. You didn't just demonstrate superior capability. You successfully transferred that capability to operators who desperately needed it. Thank you, sir, she said, uncertain where this assessment was leading. I have a proposal for you, and I need you to hear me out completely before responding. Merrick's tone shifted into the command voice that preceded important decisions. Naval Special Warfare Command is developing an advanced marksmanship program for SEAL teams operating in extreme environmental conditions. Desert, mountain, maritime environments where standard training doesn't fully prepare operators for the complexity they face. We need subject matter experts who can develop curriculum and provide instruction at the highest level. Kira felt something tighten in her chest, recognizing the shape of what was coming and the implications it carried. Based on what I've observed, you're exactly the caliber of expert we need, Merrick continued. Your technical knowledge is exceptional, your teaching ability is proven, and you understand the specific challenges of reading complex environmental conditions at extreme range. I want to offer you a position as a civilian marksmanship instructor with Naval Special Warfare Command. The offer hung between them, massive and unavoidable. It was validation of her expertise, recognition of capability she'd deliberately hidden, an opportunity to use her knowledge in ways that mattered operationally. It was also everything she'd been trying to escape, a path back into a world where performance and expectations would define her existence. Sir, I appreciate the offer, but I left competitive shooting specifically because I couldn't handle the pressure of constant performance evaluation. What you're describing sounds like that same pressure with higher stakes. It's different, Merrick countered. Competition is about your individual performance, your ranking, your validation through results. What I'm offering is about transfer of expertise. Your value wouldn't be measured by your personal shooting performance, but by the capability you develop in others. The focus shifts from your achievements to their success. The distinction resonated with something she'd felt while teaching the SEAL team, the satisfaction of helping others succeed that felt fundamentally different from the crushing weight of personal performance demands. But fear pressed against hope, old wounds warning against paths that might reopen them. What if I can't do it? The question emerged before she could stop it, revealing vulnerability she hadn't intended to show. What if the pressure of instruction becomes just as destructive as competition pressure was? Merrick's expression softened slightly, showing humanity beneath the command authority. Then you tell me, and we find a different role, or you walk away. No one is going to force you into a situation that's psychologically damaging. But I think you're underestimating your own resilience and misidentifying the source of your previous burnout. What do you mean? You didn't burn out from shooting or teaching. You burned out from competition, from the constant measurement against others, from the ranking system that reduced your worth to numbers on a leaderboard. Merrick gestured toward the range. What I watched over the past 2 days wasn't someone collapsing under pressure. It was someone finding purpose in helping others succeed. That's a fundamentally different dynamic. Kira turned to look at the firing line, remembering the satisfaction of watching the SEALs' comprehension dawn, the reward of seeing them successfully apply knowledge she'd shared. It had felt different from competition, cleaner somehow, less about her own validation and more about being genuinely useful. I need time to think about this, she said finally. Take 48 hours, Merrick replied. But I want you to consider something while you're deciding. You left competition because the pressure of proving your worth became toxic. What I'm offering is the opportunity to use your expertise in a context where worth isn't measured by personal performance, but by capability transfer. That's not the same trap you escaped from. He reached into his pocket and produced a business card with contact information. When you're ready to discuss this further, call me directly. This offer doesn't expire in 2 days, but I'd appreciate knowing your initial thinking sooner rather than later. Kira accepted the card, feeling its weight as more than simple paper and ink. It was a threshold, an invitation to step fully into visibility and acceptance of expertise she'd hidden. It was also terrifying in ways she couldn't fully articulate. One more thing, Merrick added, his tone shifting slightly. Your demonstration shot yesterday? That was one of the finest examples of precision shooting under pressure I've witnessed in 3 decades of observing professional marksmen. The technical execution was flawless, but what impressed me more was your composure. You weren't shooting to prove anything. You were shooting to teach something. That distinction matters more than you probably realize. He departed shortly after, his vehicle disappearing down the access road in a cloud of dust. Kira stood alone on the empty range, Merrick's card in her hand, while the sun descended toward the horizon and the desert fell into the peaceful silence that followed intense activity. Cortland approached from the equipment shed, his weathered face showing curiosity tempered with respect for whatever private conversation had just concluded. Everything okay? Commander Merrick offered me a position as a civilian marksmanship instructor with Naval Special Warfare Command, Kira said, still processing the implications herself. Cortland's eyebrows rose. That's a significant offer. What did you tell him? Then I need to think about it. She turned to face him directly. What do you think? You've known me for 18 months as a range tech, and you've now seen what I'm actually capable of. Am I crazy to consider stepping back into a world I deliberately left? He was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. I think you left competition because it was killing something in you that mattered. The question isn't whether you should go back to what you were. The question is whether this new path leads somewhere different enough to matter. He paused, his expression thoughtful. What you did for those SEALs over the past 2 days, that wasn't competition. That was service. Maybe that's the distinction you need to focus on. His words echoed Merrick's assessment, 2 different perspectives arriving at similar conclusions. She felt the weight of decision pressing on her, demanding clarity she didn't yet possess. Thanks, she said quietly. I need to figure out what I actually want versus what I'm afraid of. Take your time, Cortland replied. But for what it's worth, watching you teach those operators was watching someone doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing. There's something to be said for that kind of alignment. She completed her duties, securing the range, her movements automatic while her mind wrestled with possibilities and fears. The drive home took her through the familiar desert landscape, but everything felt different now, transformed by decisions that demanded answers she wasn't sure she had. In her sparse apartment, she sat with Merrick's card and tried to imagine what accepting his offer would mean. Teaching advanced marksmanship to SEAL teams, developing curriculum for extreme conditions, being acknowledged and valued for expertise she'd deliberately hidden. It was validation and opportunity, purpose and pressure, everything she'd wanted and everything she'd fled. The following morning arrived with crystalline clarity. The desert air cool and still before the sun's heat transformed it into the familiar, oppressive presence. Kira drove to the range with Merrick's card in her pocket and no closer to a decision than she'd been the previous evening. The comfortable anonymity of her range tech role felt simultaneously safe and suffocating, while the offered position represented both opportunity and risk in measures she couldn't quite calculate. She arrived early, as always, beginning the familiar routine of equipment preparation and target verification. The movements were automatic, muscle memory from 18 months of deliberate simplicity, but her mind was elsewhere, wrestling with questions about identity and purpose that refused easy answers. Cortland found her at the 1,200-meter target line, her hands working methodically while her expression revealed the internal struggle she was processing. "Rough night?" he asked, approaching with 2 cups of coffee in the pre-dawn light. "Couldn't stop thinking about Merrick's offer," she admitted, accepting the cup gratefully. "Keep going in circles between wanting the opportunity and being terrified of what accepting it would mean. What specifically terrifies you?" His tone was gentle but direct, the question of someone who understood that naming fears was the first step toward addressing them. Kira was quiet for a moment, organizing thoughts she'd been avoiding examining too closely. What if I accept and discover that any performance-based role triggers the same burnout I experienced in competition? What if helping people isn't enough to offset the pressure of being evaluated and measured? What if I'm just trading one destructive situation for another? Those are fair concerns, Cortland acknowledged. But I'd ask you this. When you were teaching those SEALs, when you were helping them understand conditions they couldn't decode, did it feel like the competition pressure you described? Did it feel destructive? She considered the question honestly, remembering the satisfaction of watching comprehension dawn, the reward of seeing them successfully apply what she'd taught. No, she admitted. It felt completely different. It felt like purpose. Then maybe that's your answer. He sipped his coffee, his weathered face thoughtful in the gathering light. You're not being asked to compete. You're being asked to teach. If those feel fundamentally different to you, then the situations aren't equivalent. But what if the pressure builds over time? What if institutional expectations become just as crushing as competitive rankings were? What if they don't? Cortland countered gently. You're building elaborate defenses against possibilities that might never materialize. Meanwhile, you're watching an opportunity to do meaningful work slip away because you're afraid of what might happen rather than evaluating what actually is happening. The sound of approaching vehicles interrupted their conversation. Kira turned to see several trucks arriving, recognizing them as belonging to the SEAL team that had just completed qualifications. Confusion mixed with curiosity as she watched them park and begin unloading equipment. Brennan emerged from the lead vehicle, spotting Kira and Cortland near the target line and heading their direction with purposeful strides. His expression carried determination mixed with something that might have been gratitude. "Vance, glad you're here early," he called out as he approached. Team wanted to come back for additional training while the knowledge is fresh and conditions are similar. Figured we'd take advantage of your presence if you're willing to provide some advanced instruction. The request surprised her, operators choosing to return for voluntary training when they'd already achieved passing qualifications. "I'm just a range tech," she said reflexively, the old deflection automatic. "You don't need my permission to train here." Brennan's expression shifted to something firmer. "With respect, Vance, you're not just a range tech, and we all know it now. You're a subject matter expert whose instruction made the difference between our success and failure." If you're willing to provide additional guidance, we'd be grateful for it. If you're not, we'll train on our own and appreciate what you've already done for us." The directness of his acknowledgement cut through her habitual deflection, forcing her to respond to who she actually was rather than the role she'd been hiding behind. "What kind of advanced instruction are you looking for?" "We want to push the envelope," he replied. "Longer ranges, more challenging conditions, scenarios that exceed standard qualification requirements. We're deploying to an environment where extreme range capability could be the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Now that we understand the fundamentals you taught us, we want to extend that knowledge as far as possible." Kira felt something shift in her perspective, seeing the request not as pressure for her to perform, but as operators seeking knowledge that could save lives in operational environments. The distinction Merrick had drawn between competition and service suddenly felt more concrete, more meaningful. "All right," she said, making a decision that felt both significant and natural. "Let's see how far we can extend your capability." The morning transformed into an intensive advanced training session, Kira pushing the SEAL team to ranges and conditions that challenged even her expertise. They worked at 1,800 meters, then 2,000, the distances requiring environmental reading so precise that minor errors translated to complete misses. She moved between shooters, providing real-time guidance and corrections, watching them struggle and adapt and gradually extend their effective range beyond anything they'd previously achieved. The teaching felt natural, purposeful, fundamentally different from the competitive environment that had burned her out. Drummond was attempting a 2,000-meter shot, the target barely visible in the heavy mirage, when Kieran noticed something in his body position that was creating inconsistent results. "Your breathing rhythm is fighting your natural pause," she observed, moving closer to his position. "You're trying to force the shot instead of letting it happen in the stable window. Relax into it. Trust the process you built." He adjusted, took 3 breaths to reset, and broke the shot on the natural pause she described. The impact was clean, center mass at a distance most shooters never attempted. His expression showed the satisfaction of pushing capability beyond previous limitations. "How did you see that?" he asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. "The breathing issue, I mean. Phillips is my spotter, and he didn't catch it." "Pattern recognition from watching thousands of shots," Kira replied. "You develop an eye for the subtle indicators that predict performance. It's teachable, but it takes time and attention most people don't invest. Could you teach us that?" Brennan interjected, his command focus evident. "That level of diagnostic capability would make us more effective at self-correction and peer coaching." "Yes," she said, the answer coming without hesitation. "It's advanced observational skill development, but you're all capable of learning it." The training continued through the morning and into early afternoon, each shooter pushing their capabilities while Kira provided the guidance that helped them avoid the pitfalls and frustrations that typically accompanied learning at this level. She found herself fully engaged, not performing but facilitating, not competing but enabling. During a break, Martinez approached her with an expression that mixed respect and something like concern. "Can I ask you something personal?" he said, his tone suggesting he understood he was treading on sensitive ground. She nodded, curious where this was leading. "Chief Brennan mentioned that Commander Merrick offered you a position as a marksmanship instructor." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I hope you're seriously considering it, because what you're doing right now, this is what you're supposed to be doing. Anyone watching can see it." The observation echoed what Cortland had said earlier, multiple perspectives arriving at the same conclusion from different angles. "What makes you say that?" "Because you're not just technically expert," Martinez explained. "You're invested in our success in a way that goes beyond professional obligation. When Johnson was struggling with that 1,800-meter attempt, you didn't just tell him what to fix. You helped him understand why it mattered and gave him the confidence to push through the frustration. That's not just instruction. That's genuine care about whether we succeed." His words resonated with something she'd been feeling but hadn't fully articulated. The satisfaction of the past few days hadn't come from demonstrating her own capability, but from watching others develop capabilities they didn't know they possessed. That was fundamentally different from competition, where success was measured by individual performance against others. "Thank you for saying that," she said quietly. "It helps clarify some things I've been struggling with." The afternoon wound down with the SEAL team showing dramatic improvement even at extreme ranges, their performance reflecting both natural aptitude and the enhanced instruction Kira had provided. As they prepared to depart, Brennan gathered everyone for a brief after-action discussion. "Outstanding training day," he announced. "Performance exceeded expectations across the board." He turned to Kira directly. "Vance, on behalf of the team, I want to thank you for the additional instruction. What you've given us goes beyond qualification standards. You've fundamentally enhanced our operational capability." The team added their acknowledgments, genuine appreciation from operators who understood the value of expertise freely shared. As they departed, several of them approached individually to shake her hand and express personal gratitude that felt more like respect between peers than deference to a superior. Cortland found her securing equipment after the last vehicle departed, the range falling into the peaceful silence that followed intensive activity. "You look different," he observed. "Lighter somehow." "I think I figured out what I was afraid of versus what's actually real," she replied, feeling clarity emerging from the confusion that had plagued her. "Competition was about proving my worth through performance that could be measured and ranked. What Merrick is offering is about helping others develop capability that matters operationally. Those aren't the same thing. So what are you going to do?" Kira pulled Merrick's card from her pocket, studying it in the fading afternoon light. "I'm going to call him and accept the position. Not because I'm certain it will work out perfectly, but because hiding expertise that could help people isn't actually protecting me from anything. It's just wasting capability that could matter." Cortland smiled, genuine satisfaction in his weathered features. "Good choice. For what it's worth, I think you're going to be excellent at it." She completed her duties securing the range, but this time the familiar movements felt less like routine and more like transition. The comfortable anonymity was ending, replaced by acknowledged expertise and the opportunities that came with it. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measures, but standing on the range in the desert evening, she felt more like herself than she had in 18 months. That evening, Kira sat in her apartment with her phone in one hand and Commander Merritt's card in the other, feeling the weight of the decision she'd made but hadn't yet acted upon. The familiar fear pressed against her resolve, old wounds warning that stepping back into visibility might resurrect everything she'd fled. But stronger than the fear was the clarity that had emerged through teaching, the understanding that purpose and pressure weren't inevitably linked when the focus shifted from personal validation to helping others succeed. She dialed the number before doubt could undermine her decision. Merrick answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the crisp efficiency of someone accustomed to important calls at irregular hours. "Commander Merrick." "Sir, this is Kira Vance. You asked me to call when I'd made a decision about your offer." There was a brief pause, and she could hear the subtle shift in his tone that indicated focused attention. "I'm glad you called. What did you decide?" "I'd like to accept the position," she said, feeling the words solidify something that had been theoretical into concrete reality. "I spent today providing advanced instruction to the SEAL team, and it confirmed what you said about the difference between competition and teaching. This feels like the right path." "Outstanding," Merrick replied, genuine satisfaction evident in his voice. "I'll initiate the paperwork immediately. We'll need to process your civilian contractor credentials, arrange security clearances, and establish your position within the Naval Special Warfare Training Command structure. That will take approximately 3 weeks. Can you start in a month?" "Yes, sir," she confirmed, feeling both excitement and apprehension at the concrete timeline. "Excellent. I'll have my administrative staff contact you tomorrow with the details. Welcome to Naval Special Warfare Command, Miss Vance. I think you're going to find this role suits you better than you might expect." After the call concluded, Kira sat in the quiet apartment, feeling the magnitude of what she'd just committed to. The safe anonymity was ending, replaced by acknowledged expertise and institutional responsibility. It was everything she'd been avoiding and everything she discovered she actually needed. The following morning, she arrived at the range to find Cortland already present, a knowing expression on his weathered face suggesting he'd anticipated her decision before she'd confirmed it. "You called Merrick," he observed, statement rather than question. "Last night. I start in a month once the paperwork processes." Cortland extended his hand, the gesture carrying respect and approval. "Congratulations. Naval Special Warfare is getting an exceptional instructor, whether they fully realize it yet or not." The news spread quickly through the small community that worked the range complex. By mid-morning, several people had approached to offer congratulations or express surprise that the quiet range tech was actually a national-level competitive shooter taking a position as a civilian marksmanship instructor with SEAL teams. The SEAL team returned 2 days later for another voluntary training session, and Brennan pulled Kira aside before the formal training began. "Heard you accepted Merrick's offer," he said, his expression showing approval. "That's excellent news for Naval Special Warfare and for the operators who will benefit from your instruction." "Thank you, Chief. I'm looking forward to it, though I'd be lying if I said I wasn't nervous about whether I can actually deliver at the level expected." "You already proved you could deliver," Brennan replied firmly. "What you did for my team wasn't beginner's luck or one-time success. It was expertise applied effectively under pressure. Trust that capability." The training session that followed felt different, no longer a temporary assistance, but the beginning of a professional relationship that would extend beyond this range and these specific operators. Kira found herself thinking strategically about curriculum development, considering how to structure instruction for maximum effectiveness, planning beyond immediate needs to long-term capability building. During a break, she received a call from Merrick's administrative office confirming her start date and providing preliminary information about the training program she'd be developing. The scope was substantial, extending beyond basic marksmanship to include environmental analysis, advanced ballistics, and diagnostic instruction that would create self-sufficient expert shooters rather than operators dependent on outside guidance. The challenge was significant, but listening to the program description, she felt excitement rather than dread. This wasn't about her performance or her validation. It was about building capability in others, creating expertise that would matter operationally. 3 weeks passed in a blur of transition activities, completing her responsibilities as range tech while preparing for a new role. The comfortable routine that had defined 18 months was giving way to something more demanding and more meaningful. On her final day as range tech, the SEAL team organized an impromptu recognition ceremony, gathering at the range with more formality than their typical training sessions. Brennan presented her with a SEAL Team 5 command coin, the gesture carrying weight beyond the physical object. "This is given to people who've made significant contributions to our team's operational readiness," he explained, his voice carrying the gravity of someone who understood the meaning behind the gesture. "What you did for us went beyond instruction. You gave us capability that will save lives downrange. That matters more than any formal recognition could convey." The team added their individual acknowledgments, operators who dismissed her as incompetent 3 weeks ago, now showing genuine respect and gratitude. Martinez approached with an expression that mixed appreciation and something like apology. "I keep thinking about how differently things would have gone if you'd stayed invisible," he said quietly. "We would have failed qualification, faced roster changes, and never understood what we were missing. Thank you for being willing to step forward when we needed expertise we didn't even know was available." Kira felt the weight of his words, understanding that her decision to reveal herself had affected outcomes beyond her personal journey. "Sometimes being invisible isn't protecting anyone," she replied. "Sometimes it's just wasting capability that could matter." The ceremony concluded with handshakes and well wishes, the SEALs departing with the satisfaction of operators who'd overcome significant challenges through effective instruction and their own determined effort. Cortland found her completing final paperwork in the range office, her desk cleared of the accumulated materials from 18 months of technical work. Strange feeling? He asked, leaning against the doorframe. Very strange, she confirmed. This job was supposed to be permanent safety. Turned out it was just a necessary pause before figuring out what actually mattered. What did you figure out? That hiding from pressure by eliminating all performance expectations doesn't actually solve anything. It just creates different problems. She organized the last of her paperwork, her movements final and deliberate. The answer isn't eliminating expectations. It's finding expectations that align with purpose rather than contradict it. That's wisdom that took me about 20 years longer to learn, Cortland observed with a slight smile. You're ahead of schedule. Her new position began the following Monday at the Naval Special Warfare Training Facility, the institutional environment dramatically different from the quiet range complex she'd grown accustomed to. The first week was orientation and administrative processing, familiarizing herself with the command structure and the scope of the training program she'd be developing. Commander Merrick met with her personally to discuss program objectives and operational requirements, his assessment direct and focused. Your primary responsibility is developing curriculum for advanced marksmanship in extreme environmental conditions, he explained. Secondary responsibility is direct instruction for SEAL teams preparing for specific deployment environments. Tertiary responsibility is diagnostic assessment of existing training programs and recommendations for improvement. The scope was substantial, but rather than feeling overwhelming, it felt like appropriate challenge matched to capability. This was what expertise was for, not personal validation, but contribution that mattered beyond individual achievement. The first SEAL team, she worked with approach instruction with the skepticism of operators evaluating someone new and improving. But by the second training session, after watching her diagnostic capability and experiencing the effectiveness of her environmental reading instruction, skepticism transformed into engaged attention. Word spread through the special operations community with the efficiency that characterized professional networks. The civilian instructor with national-level competitive background who could read conditions better than most military snipers became a resource that units requested specifically for pre-deployment training. If this story moved you, share your thoughts about your favorite moment or character, or tell us about a time when someone surprised you by revealing hidden expertise. Drop a comment below and let us know what resonated with you. 6 months into her new role, Kira found herself standing on a different range in different conditions, working with a different SEAL team, facing their own challenging qualification requirements. The work was demanding, the expectations significant, but fundamentally different from competitive pressure because success was measured by their capability rather than her validation. She watched an operator successfully execute a shot he'd been struggling with, his expression showing the satisfaction of breakthrough comprehension, and felt the familiar reward of expertise effectively transferred. This was what she'd been searching for without knowing it during those 18 months of deliberate invisibility, purpose that aligned with capability rather than contradicted it. The desert sun beat down with familiar intensity. The mirage danced across the range in patterns she could read like language. And somewhere in the transition from hidden to acknowledged, from suppressed to utilized, she'd found something more valuable than safety or anonymity. She'd found the understanding that expertise in used was its own burden, and that stepping into visibility didn't have to resurrect old wounds if the context was fundamentally different. The range stretched ahead, marked with targets at distances that challenged even expert shooters, and she stood ready to help operators develop the capability they needed to succeed. Not competing, not proving, just teaching. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was exactly what she was supposed to be doing. The afternoon session continued, and Kira Vance, former competitive shooter turned invisible range tech turned acknowledged expert instructor, moved between firing points with the confidence of someone who'd finally figured out the difference between pressure that destroyed and purpose that sustained. The journey from national rankings to deliberate anonymity to meaningful service had been longer and more complicated than she'd anticipated. But standing here now, helping others succeed in ways that mattered operationally, she understood that some paths only made sense when you looked back at them from the destination. The work continued, demanding and rewarding, and she was finally exactly where she belonged.